It started out like any other day at the office, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. For years, my job had been predictable, almost mundane. The kind of routine that gave me a sense of comfort, where each day looked and felt like the one before. My boss was always just my boss. He was the man in charge, someone I respected but never thought of outside of work. I was happily married, after all. My husband and I had built a life together, a stable, comfortable life. I thought that was enough for me. I thought I was content. Then everything changed. It was a Friday night and I had to stay late to finish up a project. My boss offered to stay and help, which at first I thought was a simple gesture. He was usually all business, very focused and serious. But that night something felt different. As the office emptied out and it was just the two of us, a strange kind of tension filled the air. The fluorescent lights, usually so harsh and unforgiving, seemed to soften, casting an almost intimate glow across the room. I remember the exact moment when things shifted. He came over to my desk to go over some final details, leaning in closer than usual, his voice low and warm as he explained something I can't even remember now. I was barely listening, my mind racing as I realized just how close he was, how I could feel his breath on my shoulder. It felt like a spark, an electric current shooting straight through me. For a moment I could barely breathe. And then he reached out, almost casually, to brush a stray hair from my face. It was a small gesture, so small that I could have dismissed it as nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like an invitation. The rest of that night was a blur. We finished our work, but my mind was far from the task at hand. I kept replaying that moment, analyzing every second, every glance, every touch. By the time I left the office, my heart was racing, my face flushed with a mix of guilt and excitement. I went home to my husband, trying to push the memory aside, to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that nothing had really happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. There was something there, something unspoken between us. The next few days were torture. Every time I saw my boss in the office, my stomach twisted with nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at me differently, that he knew the effect he had on me. And I hated myself for feeling the way I did. I was a married woman, committed to a man who loved me, a man who had never done anything to deserve this betrayal. But I couldn't deny the thrill, the excitement that came with the secrecy, the forbidden nature of it all. It was like a drug, and I was already addicted. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just harmless flirting, that it didn't mean anything, but every time we crossed paths, that spark flared up again, stronger than before. I would catch him watching me, his gaze lingering a little too long, his smile a little too, and each time I felt my resolve weaken, the line between right and wrong blur a little more. It felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff, peering over the side. I knew that one wrong step could send me plunging into something I couldn't come back from. But the thrill of it, the adrenaline, was intoxicating. I was a moth drawn to a flame, fully aware of the danger but unable to pull myself away. This attraction, this desire, was awakening something in me, something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. Over the next few weeks, my boss and I grew closer in ways that I hadn't anticipated. It started with small things, a lingering smile, an extra long conversation, moments when he'd pass by my desk just a bit more often than necessary. At first, I told myself that it was innocent, that I was reading too much into things, but with each interaction, that small, nagging thrill grew stronger, and the line between work and whatever this was became increasingly blurred. One evening, we found ourselves alone in the office again, both of us staying late to meet a deadline. I was already on edge, hyper-aware of his presence across the room, feeling his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. The air between us felt thick, charged, and I was restless, torn between the comfort of the life I had and the pull I felt toward him, a pull I could no longer deny. As I packed up to leave, he walked over to me, closer than he ever had before. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in, making it nearly impossible to look away. He leaned against the edge of my desk, casually at first, but then he tilted his head slightly, his eyes intense, filled with something I hadn't seen before. "You know," he said softly, his voice laced with that same intensity. "You've been working so hard. You deserve to relax, maybe even enjoy yourself a little." I felt my pulse quicken. The way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine, and I knew what he meant. My mind screamed at me to back away, to leave before this went any further, but my body refused to move. I managed a nervous laugh, trying to play it cool, but he could see through me. He reached out, brushing his hand along my arm, and the warmth of his touch set every nerve in my body on fire. His hand lingered, a question in his eyes that I wasn't prepared to answer. But he didn't need me to say anything. He could already see the answer in the way I looked back at him, my face flushed, my breathing uneven. In that moment, the final barrier between us broke down. He took my hand and I followed him, barely aware of where we were going, only focused on the sensation of his hand in mine, the thrill that drowned out every rational thought. When we stopped, we were in one of the empty meeting rooms, far enough from the rest of the office that no one would see or hear us. My mind raced with a mix of excitement and fear, every cell in my body screaming at me to turn back, to walk away, but I couldn't. I was caught in the moment, drawn to him in a way that defied logic. He stepped behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders, pulling me close. It was a gesture that felt strangely safe and intimate, yet there was nothing innocent about it. I knew in some twisted way that I was allowing this because of the illusion of distance. By not facing him, it was easier to pretend that I wasn't crossing a line, that I wasn't betraying everything my husband and I had built. I could fool myself into thinking that it wasn't real, that it was just a game, a moment of weakness I could leave behind once it was over. But as he held me, I knew there was no going back. Each touch was a step further away from my marriage, from the life I had promised to uphold. I could feel the weight of my actions even as I gave in to the thrill of the moment. The sense of secrecy only heightened everything, making the experience feel more intense, more forbidden. My mind told me to stop, but my body had already made the decision. I was lost in the moment, allowing myself to be swept away by a passion I hadn't felt in years. The guilt lingered in the back of my mind, but it was overpowered by the immediate rush, the satisfaction of having something new, something that felt just a little bit dangerous. I told myself that this would be a one-time thing, that I could walk away and forget it happened, bury it deep and never think of it again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had tasted the thrill, felt the rush of crossing a line I could never uncross, and I knew I was already in too deep. The morning after our first real encounter, guilt hit me like a wave. I woke up next to my husband, lying in our bed, feeling a sickening twist in my stomach. He was still asleep, unaware of the betrayal I had just committed. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, replaying every moment of the night before. The thrill that had felt so intoxicating in the moment now left a bitter taste. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment, something I could move past if I just pushed it to the back of my mind. But the guilt wasn't easy to ignore. Every time my husband looked at me, I felt exposed, like he could see through me, past every lie I'd told to keep this hidden. I'd catch myself withdrawing from him, creating distance because the shame was just too heavy. Yet, strangely, that distance only made me crave my boss more. I felt like I was living a double life, one foot in my marriage, pretending everything was fine, and the other in this secret affair that was growing harder to ignore. My boss's words echoed in my mind, the way he'd said we could keep things quiet, discreet, so my husband would never have to know. That was the deal, the twisted bargain I'd agreed to, and I kept telling myself that as long as I was careful, no one would get hurt. But I underestimated just how addictive it would become. I'd see my boss in the office, and all the guilt would slip away, replaced by that same rush, that same sense of anticipation. I found myself looking forward to those fleeting touches, those stolen glances, the secretive thrill of it all. We were both careful, making sure no one could suspect what was going on between us. It became a game, a carefully orchestrated act, where every move had to be calculated to avoid drawing attention. We made sure our meetings were in secluded parts of the office, places where no one would wander in and catch us, and the more we got away with it, the bolder we became. But with each stolen moment, the guilt dug deeper. I could barely look my husband in the eye, knowing what I was doing behind his back. Every time he smiled at me or reached out to hold my hand, I felt like a fraud, someone pretending to be a loyal wife while keeping a twisted secret buried just beneath the surface. I started avoiding his questions, brushing off his attempts to connect. When he asked why I'd been coming home so late or why I seemed distant, I'd laugh it off, saying work had just been stressful. And he believed me. He trusted me. That, more than anything, made the guilt almost unbearable. There were times when I'd swear to myself that I'd stop, that I'd end it with my boss and go back to my normal life, focusing on my marriage, on making things right. But every time I tried to pull away, my boss would find some way to draw me back in a subtle touch, a whispered word, a reminder of the thrill we shared. He seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear, making it impossible for me to resist. It was like he could sense my weakness, the part of me that craved the excitement he offered, and every time he pulled me back, I'd convince myself that it was just one more time, that I'd find a way to stop eventually. But eventually never came. As the weeks went on, it became a twisted routine. I'd go to work, sneak around with my boss, and then come home desperately trying to act normal, to be the wife my husband expected me to be. But the guilt never really went away. It lurked beneath the surface, resurfacing every time I caught my husband's trusting gaze, every time he told me he loved me. I wanted to tell him the truth, to come clean and admit what I'd done. But the thought of shattering his trust, of breaking his heart, was too much to bear. And so I kept it hidden, burying the guilt and hoping that somehow I'd be able to move past it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was trapped in a web of lies and secrets, caught between the thrill of my affair and the shame of my betrayal. Every day, the weight of it grew heavier, the line between right and wrong fading until I couldn't tell one from the other. I'd already gone too far, and I couldn't see a way out. As the affair continued, secrecy became our lifeline. My boss and I had to be careful, hyper-aware of every detail, every alibi, every word. We were no longer just playing with fire, we were surrounded by it, trying to control the flames without getting burned. My life became a balancing act, carefully juggling the roles of a devoted wife and a woman entangled in a dangerous affair. The thrill of it was intoxicating, but with every encounter, the risk grew, and I knew a single slip-up could ruin everything. The close calls started to come more often. My husband began noticing my late nights and the constant excuses. He'd ask me why I seemed distant, why I was more irritable or distracted, and I'd force myself to laugh it off. Work is just crazy right now, I'd say. Or, I'm exhausted, but it'll pass, and he'd believe me. Or at least he wanted to believe me. I could see the worry in his eyes, and it crushed me, yet I couldn't stop myself. The pull toward my boss had become too strong, like an addiction I didn't want to admit I had. There were moments that made my heart stop. Like the time I forgot to delete a text from my boss, a casual, harmless message on the surface, but one that would have unraveled everything if my husband had seen it. I'd almost fainted when I realized my mistake, rushing to delete it and praying that he wouldn't look through my phone. The smallest slip-up now felt like a matter of life and death. It terrified me how reckless I'd become, but it didn't stop me. The risk, the adrenaline of sneaking around, had become as intoxicating as the affair itself. And then there was the cologne. My boss had this distinct scent, one that clung to me after our encounters. Once, my husband leaned in close and paused, sniffing the air with a puzzled expression. My heart leaped into my throat, and I forced a laugh, making up some story about trying a new perfume. He smiled, believing me or pretending to, perhaps, but I could feel the suspicion growing. He'd never questioned me before, never had a reason to. But now, every time he looked at me, I felt his gaze linger, like he was searching for cracks in the person he thought he knew. In the office, my boss and I became masters of secrecy. We had routines, planned rendezvous, escape plans if anyone got too close. It was a twisted game of hide and seek, where the stakes were everything we both stood to lose. We'd meet in storage rooms, deserted hallways, places where no one would expect us. We'd perfected the art of the quick, discreet glance, the innocent touch that held so much more meaning than anyone could know. It was exhilarating and exhausting, keeping up the charade, constantly on edge and always watching our backs. But the guilt was always there, a shadow that followed me home every night. I'd sit at the dinner table, my husband across from me, and feel the weight of every lie I'd told him. He'd ask how my day was, and I'd give some vague answer, avoiding details, afraid that one small slip could expose everything. I could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes as I pulled away emotionally, building walls to keep him from getting too close. I'd convinced myself that I was protecting him, sparing him from the truth, but deep down I knew I was only making things worse. Yet, despite the lies, the close calls, the guilt, I couldn't bring myself to stop. There was something about the affair that kept pulling me back, a need for excitement, for danger, that I hadn't realized was buried inside me. My boss had become more than just a forbidden lover. He was an escape, a thrill that reminded me I was still alive, still capable of feeling something intense and uncontrollable. And I knew that, as long as he was in my life, I'd keep risking everything, no matter how much I hated myself for it. The longer it went on, the more entangled I became, trapped between two lives that felt worlds apart. I couldn't let go of either, unable to walk away from the comfort of my marriage or the thrill of my affair. I was balancing on a knife's edge, knowing that one day I'd slip and everything would come crashing down. But as much as I tried to ignore it, that part of me craved the danger, the possibility that one day our secret would be exposed. It was a dangerous game, one that couldn't last forever, but for now I was still playing, clinging to both lives, terrified of what would happen when I finally had to choose. The collapse came sooner than I had imagined, with a force I wasn't prepared for. One evening, I returned home from work to find my husband waiting for me, sitting in silence at the kitchen table. His face was pale, his jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt, anger, and disbelief. My heart stopped. Instinctively, I knew he had found out. The careful balancing act one maintained for months had crumbled, and there was no more hiding. He didn't shout or accuse. Instead, he simply looked at me and asked, "Is there something you want to tell me?" His tone was calm, almost too calm, and it only made the guilt hit harder. I felt my stomach twist, my hands trembling as I stood there, unable to meet his gaze. I could have lied, made some excuse, tried to wiggle my way out, but seeing the hurt in his eyes, knowing that I had shattered his trust, left me speechless. There was no way to repair what I'd done, no easy explanation that could erase the pain I'd caused. I finally admitted everything, feeling the words spill out like poison. I told him about the affair, about the sneaking around, the lies. Each word felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage, each confession a blow to the life we had built together. As I spoke, I saw the shock and disbelief in his eyes turn to something colder, something that made my chest ache with regret. He sat there silent, absorbing it all, and when I finally finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. The silence was unbearable, filling the room with a weight that pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stood up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I trusted you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I thought we had something real. Hearing the pain in his voice broke me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I tried to apologize, to explain that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. But my words felt hollow, meaningless against the enormity of the betrayal. He told me he needed time, that he couldn't even look at me right now. I watched as he packed a bag, his movements slow and deliberate, each one a reminder of the life I had destroyed. He left without looking back, and as the door closed behind him, I felt the full weight of my actions crash down on me. I was alone, left to confront the mess I'd made, the consequences I'd spent so long trying to avoid. In the days that followed, I tried to reach out to him, to repair the damage. I sent messages, left voicemails, begged him to give me a chance to make things right. But he remained silent, and each unanswered call, each ignored message, was a reminder of the pain I'd caused. Friends and family began to reach out, subtly hinting that they knew something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. The shame was overwhelming, a constant reminder of the mistakes I couldn't undo. The affair with my boss ended abruptly. After my husband found out, I couldn't stand the thought of going back to work, of facing the man who had been a part of the destruction of my marriage. I felt nothing but regret when I thought of him, The thrill and excitement that had once drawn me to him now felt tainted and hollow. I resigned quietly, disappearing without explanation, leaving behind the life I had once known. In the months that followed, I was left to pick up the pieces, haunted by the choices that had led me here. My husband eventually filed for divorce, and I couldn't blame him. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, shattered his trust, and left scars that would never fully heal. I moved out of our home, the home we had built together, and found myself in a small apartment, surrounded by the emptiness of a life I had destroyed. I spent countless nights replaying everything in my mind, wondering how I had let things spiral so far out of control. The thrill, the excitement that had once felt so irresistible, now seemed meaningless in the face of the pain I had caused. I had lost everything: my marriage, my home, my sense of self, all for a fleeting moment of passion that left nothing but regret in its wake. Looking back, I realized that the affair hadn't just been a betrayal of my husband, it had been a betrayal of myself, of the person I thought I was. I had crossed lines I once believed I would never cross, made choices I couldn't take back, and in the end, I was left with nothing but the ashes of the life I had burned to the ground.